I want to tell you a story of something that happened to me when I was 7 years old. Okay, so this is going way back, long time ago. I was living in Michigan. We lived on kind of a farm way out in the boonies. And I was 7 years old. It was the day before Mother's Day. Okay, so day before Mother's Day, and I didn't have a present for my mom. And I was thinking to myself, like, oh man, like I want to make the best Mother's Day present in the world for my mom, because she deserves it, right? Because she loves me. I was cute like that. And one thing about my mom, so I was trying to think, one thing about my mom, she loved birds. Like, kind of lived in the country, there were a lot of birds around. She loved birds. Our house was like covered with bird stuff. So we had bird paintings, bird figurines, like bird feeders all over our porch. She was constantly feeding the birds and taking pictures of them, and she loved birds, all right? So it's like, all right, I'm gonna build my mom a birdhouse. I build her a birdhouse, I'm gonna make the most perfect, like the best birdhouse ever, and she's gonna love it. I'm 7 years old, but I could work with wood when I was 7, believe it or not. And so my dad had this little shop out in his barn, lots of scrap wood, and I kind of went out there and I sorted through it one day and found the perfect pieces. So I got the one, I got the front, I cut a little hole in it, and I was loving it. I figured out how to kind of piece it together to make this birdhouse. And then I started nailing the wood together, and kind of piece by piece it started to come together, and I was like, all right, this is good, I'm loving this, I'm super proud of myself, pumped as a little 7-year-old, man, my mom's gonna love this, like, she's gonna think I'm the best son ever, and, but I got to the last board, the front board, which is the most important one, it's the one with the hole on it the bird actually goes in to live in the birdhouse, and has a peg, to like kind of stand on and stuff. And I went to pound it in, it's like the last step, and I pounded in, kind of the nail like, slid up, and I kind of missed it, and I was like, oh, man, whatever. So I pulled it out and went to pound it in a different spot, and the nail slid up in a different place and like chipped the wood, and I was like getting super mad. And I went to go do it again, and like a whole corner of the piece of wood broke off. I remember this so clear, it's crazy. And I did it one more time, and I was so frustrated this time. Like, I cannot get this nail in, like what in the world's going on? And I pounded it in, and sure enough, the nail like slid up, and by this point the birdhouse is all like beat up, from me banging on it and the nail, and I got so mad. I'm like, whatever, I hate this birdhouse, it's all messed up, it's not the perfect birdhouse that it was supposed to be, I've screwed it up, my mom's gonna hate it, and so I went to smash it. I was like, oh, like this is horrible, and I went and I grabbed the birdhouse to smash it, and not remembering that I totally missed the nail went straight through my hand. And there I am, 7 years old, like screaming, running into the house, and I got this like bloody birdhouse attached to my hand. You can picture this. And I run in, I'm just bawling, and my parents were, what just happened? Luckily my grandparents were there. My grandpa's like, he was a construction worker, so he built houses, and he saw it, and he's like, that happens to me like all the time. And he just grabbed it and yanked it out. I was like, ah! But there, and anyway, my mom was like, what happened? Like, how did that happen to you? And I was like, I was building this birdhouse, it was gonna be perfect, you were gonna love it, but I kept messing it up, and it became damaged, and it was broken, and I couldn't get it right. You were gonna hate it, so I got so mad I wanted to destroy it, I was gonna build another one or whatever. And my mom looked at it, and she's like, I love it. I'm like, it's perfect to me. Like, I don't care if you've missed it. I don't care if it's all, beat up or if the corners aren't right. She's like, I love it. It's awesome. And she took it and she kind of hung it on. I gave it to her the next day. Bloodstains all over it or whatever. But my grandpa helped me like put the top board on, and so like the bird wouldn't actually impale itself, because that would be really bad. But she hung it on the tree like right outside our front porch, and I don't know if it's probably not still there or anything. We moved like a year later, but I got so frustrated in the moment because it was flawed. It wasn't perfect. I messed up, and I thought that my mom wouldn't like it, that she'd be disappointed with the flaws as I was disappointed with not being able to make it perfect. But she didn't. She loved it. Even though it had cracks, even though it had holes, even though it had chipped and messed up, she loved it because it was from It was from me, right? And she loved me. And I think in our relationship with God, a lot of times we have that same mindset. And I don't know if you guys are like me, but I struggle with this a lot. I struggle with this guilt of looking at my life and thinking, man, like, I've messed up a lot. Like, I've made a lot of bad decisions. I have screwed up and turned against God all the time. It's constant in my life. And I don't know if you have ever thought that way before, but if you just look at your life and say, man, I've messed up too many times. I have too many flaws. I can't stop screwing things up. I can't make things right. And no way would God want me, right? I'm not good enough. Why would he want a relationship with a person like me because of the things that I've done and because of how I live my life? And I don't know, if you guys have ever felt that way before, because I have. And maybe you've been told that before, that you're not good enough for God, that you are too bad of a person, that God would never want you, that you have to clean yourself up. And so we're going to be looking at that exact thing right now in Matthew chapter 9. Let's just read it together. Just Matthew chapter 9, verse 9. It says, as Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth. And he said to him, follow me. And he rose and followed him. All right there, we have like the Guinness Book of World Records for the shortest testimony ever. Matthew is written by Matthew, the disciple, who's one of the 12. And this is kind of his own story of his conversion. This is his testimony story of how he came. It's like if someone came to Matthew and was like, hey Matthew, tell me how you became a disciple of Jesus. Tell me how you started following him for the first time. Matthew's like, well, I was sitting there at work and Jesus came up to me and said, follow me, and I followed him. I'm like, all right, like that's a good story. If you're a dude, you probably resonate with that. That's kind of how we explain things, especially you do something big, you go home, your parents was like, hey, how was your trip to Disneyland? You're like, good. She's like, all right, like, so what'd you do there? And you're like, stuff. She's like, all right, it's useless. That's how we are. And that's kind of what Matthew was. He's telling his conversion story, and he says, Jesus came to me, he called me, and I followed. That's it. And I think he intentionally leaves out all the details. Obviously, there's a lot more that's going on here, but I think he leaves out everything else. Just gets to the bare bones of what happens, and I think he does that intentionally on purpose. Jesus walked up to him, he called him, said, follow me, and Matthew responded. He followed. That's all that really matters. And guys, if you're a believer here, you have experienced those two things. Right? You've received the call of Jesus to follow him. And you've responded by following him. Like, that's what it takes. Right? Jesus summons you. You respond. Jesus calls you into relationship with him, and you answer. And that's intentional in this story, to bring focus to that. Where does it start? It starts with Jesus, who initiates this relationship. He makes that very clear. You know, guys, I think so many of us start our testimonies or sharing our faith with us, right? We're like, well, when I chose to be a Christian when, or, you know, I became a believer when I did this. And as the Bible makes it clear, and you see it in this, who initiates? Jesus. Right? I don't begin my relationship with God. He begins it with me. I've heard it said before, I can't remember where, but the quote says, Christianity isn't something that you take up, it takes you up. But what's so fascinating about this passage is it's not the simplicity of Matthew's testimony. It's who Matthew was. Let's look down at it again. He says, where does he come? He saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth. Who is Matthew? He's a tax collector. The Jewish people in this area hated tax collectors, like despised tax collectors. Tax collectors were the worst people in this society. They were corrupt. They charged way beyond what they were supposed to, and then pocketed that gain for themselves. And so they were rich by taking advantage of all the people around them. They worked for the Romans, who were kind of this enemy nation who came over and took control of the Jewish people, and the tax collectors were usually Jews themselves who kind of like buddied up with the enemy to kind of protect themselves, and they took advantage of their own people. So they were seen as traitors, they were seen as corrupt, they were taking from everyone else and keeping for themselves. They were the lowest of the low, hated, the most hated people in all of the land. So much so that tax collectors were banned from all religious fellowship in the temples and the synagogues in the area. They weren't even supposed to be there. They weren't allowed in. And yet Jesus comes to him and says, follow me. Jesus walks up to Matthew and chooses him and says, follow me. Let's look at verse 10. It's even worse. Jesus reclined at a table in the house. Behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and were reclining with Jesus and his disciples. So not only does Jesus call Matthew, then he goes and eats with them. He goes to his house, a house bought with corrupt money, and sits there and eats dinner with him. And not only him, but it says many other tax collectors. So he's sitting with all the others who are despised and rejected in the town. And not only that, it says, and sinners came. We don't know who that was, but you can think all of those who were the lowest of the low, those who were despised, those who were rejected, those who were outcasts of society. We don't know who was there. It could be prostitutes, it could be pimps, it could be it could be robbers, it could be thieves, it could be criminals, it could be drunkards. We don't know, but we know that they were there, and Jesus ate a meal with them. He associated himself with them. In that society, that's a big deal. Sitting down at the table and eating a meal, it means you're identifying yourself with them, that you accept them. Of course, the Pharisees look on this, and it says in verse 11, when the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? But when he heard it, he said, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice, for I come not to call the righteous, but sinners. See, the Pharisees looked upon it, and they were the religious leaders of the day. And they didn't understand what Jesus was doing, because their entire religious system was built upon this meticulous observation of every single law. Everything they focused on, they worked towards, was the perfection of themselves. Right? Their goal was to be so good, so obedient to every law and every detail and every command of God that when their time for judgment came, God would have to let them in. Because they've earned it. They've deserved it. I mean, look how hard they worked for it. So they can say, look at all my accomplishments. Look at the things that I've done. What Jesus is saying here, he's saying here to us is, he wants to be not with those who prove they deserve him because of all the things they've done, but who realize that they don't deserve him, that they absolutely need him. Guys, that's a gospel message. Right? The good news of who Jesus Christ is and what he has done in our life. That it's not about the things that we have done, our accomplishments, and being this perfect person. But Jesus is saying, I have come for those who recognize that they're sick. He's like, the healthy, they don't need a doctor. Why would you ever go to the doctor when you're perfectly healthy? You don't. That place smells, you know. It's like, who would you go to the doctor? I'm like, what are you here for? Just saying hi. And like, no, you don't do that. You go to the doctor because you're sick, because you realize that you need help, that you need medicine, you need a doctor. And Jesus is saying, I have come for those who recognize they're sick. That's who I spend time with. That's who I call. That's who I want. And guys, it's so easy for us to get caught into this cycle, trying so hard to make God happy with how we act and feeling guilty when we fail. And then trying really hard to fix it and make up for it, and then realize we can't, and then we feel more guilty. And then we try even harder, and we fail even harder, and we're filled with guilt again. And we go through this constant cycle of trying really hard, failing, being guilty about it, and doing this over and over and over. Jesus comes and says, you think you aren't good enough? You aren't. You aren't good enough. But I am. It's like you think your sin is too great. It is. It is too great. But I've taken care of that. Like you think you will never change? You won't. You won't change. But I will change you. I will change you. Guys, I hope tonight in this passage that we see our need for Jesus. That we recognize that and to see that He has come for those who desperately want